Thanks very much, Amber. So for those that joined earlier, you got to see Amber and I catch up. So it's one of those things that in the open source world, I think a lot of us have missed the in-person conferences. Today, I'm coming to you live from the beautiful, well, sort of beautiful, gray Pacific Northwest outside of Portland. And I'm really excited today to share a topic that is kind of a personal and professional passion of mine, which is finding a way to navigate and improve the relationship between the open source and open standards communities. And really, it's the primary reason that I took the job about a year ago now as the executive director of OASIS Open. And I think the combination of the two communities is going to be critical, not only to where we are in technology, I think, but to all of us worldwide. So, let's see if my slides work. So with that,
before you get started, can you tell folks about how, if they have questions throughout your talk, how they could ask them?
Yes, sorry, thanks, Amber. We were talking about that earlier, and I got so excited I just went forward. Feel free to raise your hand or type your question in chat, and I will make sure that Amber will help me get to those at the end. So thanks, everybody. Where was I? Oh, so OASIS Open. Some of you may know us, some of you may have heard of us, some of you maybe not. So I wanted to give you kind of a quick overview to give you some perspective for my presentation. We've been around since 1993. We're a worldwide organization, and last year we were very fortunate to form a European nonprofit affiliate in the Netherlands to continue the longstanding work we've done as part of the European Commission's multi-stakeholder platform. So it's the group in the European Commission that works on, and I apparently chainsaws today. Apologies, this is what happens when you work at home. We're home to many standards that some of you are probably familiar with, including SAML, UBL, AMQP, MQTT, and many others that touch your lives even if you don't know it. For example, the Common Alerting Protocol is the standard that is used for Amber Alerts for missing children in the US. Anytime you get a severe weather alert or pretty much any emergency alert that you get on your device is using the Common Alerting Protocol, which was developed here at OASIS. Many of our standards have gone on to receive de jure approval. We'll talk a little bit about what de jure approval is later. And finally, we have a broad technical agenda that covers everything from cybersecurity, blockchain, privacy, sharing economy, cryptography, cloud computing, augmented reality, emergency management, pretty much almost anything that's out there. And we have a membership that cuts across public, private, academic sectors and across the industry in general. So with that, I wanted to cover why open source and standards. So it's obviously the topic of my talk, but I wanted to kind of set the stage for why I think that this is important, and then hopefully kind of lead you through where we find common ground and how we work as foundations to do that. So with that, let's face it, obviously 2020 was a very tough year, right? COVID notwithstanding, there were a lot of other things that happened, and I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that. So because of that, I'm going to start today by sharing a challenging example to illustrate the importance of open source and standards. And it's probably not an example you'd likely think of when you're considering technology or software. So in 2020 alone, the Western United States, so primarily California, Oregon, where I'm at, and Colorado, experienced over 8,400 wildland fires, burning 5 million acres, excuse me, resulting in 9,500 homes lost, and at least as of the most recent figures I saw, 41 lives lost. Now, clearly these are very grim statistics, but I'd like to highlight that in the face of this tremendous tragedy, there are great examples of resilience, determination, and some great use of technology and standards. And I was afraid my slides are going to start going backwards. They tend to do this on Zoom. Apologies. So before moving to Oregon 3 years ago, I had the tremendous honor, and you can see sort of the firefighter in the background there, a picture on my wall, to serve the citizens of California for 10 years as a CAL FIRE volunteer. CAL FIRE being the state fire agency in California. And in that time, I helped build our volunteer communication staff, which was responsible for deploying communications command post vehicles to wildland incidents. And what would happen is on these big wildland fires, you have a lot of fire agencies that show up to fight these fires together. And we would all rely on the APCO P25 digital radio standard to communicate efficiently, providing all the safety critical information to firefighters so that they could do their job of protecting life and property. But as all of these different fire agencies came together, most of the time they brought radios from different manufacturers, which presented an interesting issue to those of us in the command post because we had to reprogram large sets of radio frequencies so they could talk to each other using that P25 standard. But because there was no standard for writing radio data to these different radios, other than the standard of serial communications, each of these manufacturers had written their own proprietary software, which really slowed the process of cloning and programming these radios because we had to keep different versions on sometimes on different laptops. You know, if the manufacturers had really all instead contributed to an open source implementation that conformed to a standard they all developed, it really would have provided a critical tool and they could have shared the cost of developing that software. So in short, this situation was one where there wasn't a competitive advantage to be gained by proprietary radio programming software and really many things to gain by standardizing it. And the benefit of coherent standards and the corresponding open source implementations is not unique to just safety critical situations like this. I think there are many areas of our lives that could benefit significantly from a better integration of standards and open source. Sliding back, there we go. So let's cover some definitions because I think I want to get some of this out of the way, and apologies that some of you may already know these things, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page as we start. So open source, right? Obviously you're here at Open Source 101. You probably know what open source is, but it's software that's available under one of the main licenses approved by OSI, or the Open Source Initiative. But it's not strictly a licensing regime. And I say this to people all the time when I did open source consulting at Red Hat and others, that it's not just about the license. It's really about the community and the generally accepted practice of that community of individuals, some who work for corporations, some who don't, that help develop that software in an open and collaborative manner. And to me, that's actually the more important part of open source other than just the license. On the open standards side, basically open standards are agreed upon definitions of functionality for a lot of different things. It could be hardware, it could be practices, et cetera, but we're going to deal with the software context here. And again, our friends at the OSI are a great resource because they've developed something that some of you may have heard of called the OSR, or the Open Standards Requirements, which sets out the definition of what exactly an open standard is. And the primary requirement of that being that the standard's freely available under license and royalty terms that allow easy and unencumbered implementation rights for everyone. So basically anyone can implement to that. If you further break down standards a bit, though, we have what are called both de facto and de jure standards. And de facto standards are usually tools or systems that are not officially recognized anywhere as standards, but they've grown through their widespread usage to be the default tool set of many users. So obviously, Microsoft Office is a great example of that. On the de jure side, de jure means basically by law. And these are standards that are built and approved by national government recognized standardization bodies like ANSI, ISO, ITU, ETSI in Europe, et cetera. And they're usually built with broad collaboration among many participants. And they are generally open standards that provide great interoperability between products from many vendors. And on kind of the other side, you have consortiums like OASIS, IEEE, ECMA, WC3, and probably some others that you've heard of. We don't hold de jure status, but we can, with the appropriate governance and permissions, submit the standards that are created in our organizations to these international standards bodies for de jure recognition, so that they are then an internationally recognized standard. See if my slides will cooperate. Yay. Okay. So where do we start at understanding why open source and standards matter to us so much in the technology space? I really like to think we need to go back to the future. And that's the beginning of the internet. So that picture there, the IMP or interface message processor, was one of the first packet switching devices on the ARPANET, which some of you may remember as the predecessor to the internet that we're on now. But it did rely on common shared software and on common communication standards that even predated TCP/IP. But as the ARPANET morphed into the internet that we know today, the bedrock of what we're relying on to have this conversation, you had standards and open source implementations combining, bringing to us things like TCP/IP, HTTP, SAML, NTP, XML, JSON, and I could go on and on. The many of these standards and open source implementations that we literally couldn't be having this virtual webinar we could be having it without those things and without the seamless integration of those open standards and open source communities. I think it's really, really important that we recapture the spirit of collaboration between the standards and open source folks as we continue to move forward in our technology journey. So if you still don't believe in the importance and the convergence of open standards and open source, can you imagine a world today? You probably can't. We're in COVID. You can't imagine a world today without the internet. You know, in the face of the pandemic, the internet and virtual communications have literally become our window on the world. And, you know, some of us were accustomed to making a commute. I've been fortunate in the last 10 years not to have to do that. I've been working remotely at that time. But for a lot of us, our homes have now also become our offices. And some of us, you know, we're used to shopping online, but now we're shopping online for a lot more things, groceries and other things, having them delivered to our doorsteps. A lot of us have cut the cord with the convenience of streaming entertainment services. And as someone with a 10-year-old, two 10-year-olds, streaming entertainment services are really important. And, you know, we're meeting our doctors virtually now. And until recently, we just sent our 10-year-old back to school, but you know, children were attending school virtually. So in short, you know, the internet's impact on our daily lives has never been more profound. And without all of this convergence, you know, we could have ended up in silos or islands of information. For those old enough to remember the AOL and CompuServe era, those were islands of information that didn't talk to each other. So without, you know, this convergence of open source and standards, we could have ended up with a very different internet than we have today. So the COVID-19 pandemic also has made very, very clear that we need to continue to invest in both open source and open standards implementations. There's already been great work going on here at OASIS in these areas. We have the Emergency Management Technical Committee, which is home to Common Alerting Protocol that I mentioned earlier, but also home to things like hospital availability and other related standards. And additionally, the AS4 standard that was built here is being used in Europe to help build COVID-19 data exchanges to help further figure out how to address things like vaccination and other things. But, you know, even with all these great standards and others that are hosted elsewhere other than OASIS, you need good open source implementations. And it's an area where public and government and private partnership has traditionally not been as strong. And so I think it's really important that we make sure that this kind of flourishes going forward. And, you know, we learned a great many lessons as a society because of the pandemic. And I think what we've all learned is being better prepared from both a mitigation standpoint with our technology, as well as looking for new ways to streamline things like vaccination rollout. I mean, I know it's been a huge issue in the US and Europe, especially figuring out how to do effective vaccination rollouts and what role technology can play in that. So from the security perspective, I think it's also important to think about how open source and open standards play together. You know, as we become more reliant on technology, our window on the world, the security threat surface has increased exponentially. And, you know, we seemingly hear daily about things like the SolarWinds hack or incursions into critical government systems or incursions into the energy grid and other critical infrastructure. And there are a lot of things that we need to work on here, but open source and open standards play a critical role in things like SBOM or the software bill of materials and things like the threat vulnerability sharing, for example, the Open Cybersecurity Alliance that we host at OASIS, or STIX, the Structured Threat Information Expression Standard, or TAXII, the Trusted Automated Exchange of Intelligence Information Standards. So there's certain standards and increasingly more open source implementations of those standards as well. And there are many large and small organizations that are really trying to tackle the problem of cybersecurity. So finding a way that we can use consistent processes to ensure interoperability and the validation of this threat data is going to continue to be a challenge. And it's an area where I think we still need to see even more and better collaboration between open source and open standards communities so that we can provide the greatest value with all of this threat data that we have. We have the great threat data, but it's getting it out there and getting it disseminated in a way that can be of the greatest value that I think is one of our big challenges. So we've sort of set the stage of the why. Well, let's talk about how we find some common ground. You know, it's important to discuss where these two communities are and where they're the same, where they're different, and how they come with different perspectives on how to solve some of these same problems. And the slides decided to be uncooperative. Apologies. So, rather than view open source and open standards as adversaries, I think let's talk a little bit about how we can come together to deliver better outcomes. And obviously, we talked about the historical perspective, but I think in the historical perspective, you'll see standards activities came to live primarily within legal departments because you had patentable or valuable intellectual property that bubbled up to legal from product and engineering. And as we all know, open source activities didn't really take that same journey because the intellectual property around them was at one point deemed less important than the outcome of what you were building in the code. But as I got further into my role here at OASIS, what I realized is that the desired outcomes of both open source and open standards communities are actually the same. And those are interoperability, choice, and innovation. And where these communities differ is in how they approach getting to those outcomes. And despite these differences, I think they all have commonality on what they're concerned about. They're concerned about governance, they're concerned about use cases, and they're concerned about their approach to consensus. In practice, there are fast open standards groups. And I know some of you out there are saying, fast open standards? That seems like an oxymoron, but they do exist. And they usually work really well with what we consider well-crafted open source projects. Excuse me. And as a matter of fact, the goal we have of our open source or our open projects program at OASIS, which I'll cover a little bit more later, is to help bring these kinds of communities together because we think there's really tremendous value in both approaches, including both for the technology creators and the consumers. One of the things I think it's important to remember is that specifications will tend to outlive code and will need more agreement to ensure that there's that long-term interoperability. But often code can help drive standards from a functionality and edge case definition standpoint. Let's talk a little bit about what I call the open development ecosystems. It's really clear to me in working with both open source and open standards communities that defining this open development ecosystem is critical. And I think it's pretty clear that technologies today are really more interdependent than ever. And sort of formal data standards, whether those are open source projects or not, those things alone don't always give buyers confidence that the technology that they're going to be using or developing is going to be interoperable. Now, the trade-off for the modularity is perhaps kind of a lack of wide interoperability, which really can drive up both short and long-term development costs for an organization. And if you take then the flip side, interoperability without that modularity is just lock-in, right? And I think a converged open development ecosystem gives more choice to everyone. So one of the other big challenges, which we talked about in the coming together slide, is finding a way to bridge that intellectual property gap, which is bringing a balance of protecting your differentiated intellectual property as an organization, but allowing and encouraging supporting non-differentiated IP and standards and code and giving those more freely to technology efforts that everyone relies on. And I think that one of the ways to do that is using major API interfaces as the bones or the starting point for the specification work, because it's not a big heavy lift. It's an easy way to get started. And it's a great way to start to provide convergence between these two communities. And it's really, really important to find good neutral governance and robust processes because there's a lot of roadblocks in the way of making these things happen. And that's the critical role of open source and open standards foundations, which I will cover at the end. So with that, let's talk about some hidden gems that are actually out there today. Because I've kind of made this sound, a little bit dire, but there's a lot of really hidden gems of collaboration between the open source and open standards communities that have already happened. And I think you look at code and standards have never really been strangers. So for example, if you look at IETF or the Internet Engineering Task Force, they've been building this notion of networking standards based on what they call rough consensus and running code for a long, long time. And our colleagues at OSI, created the open standards requirement, which we talked about earlier, which I think is, again, a great way to really give a critical mass around what an open standard is and helping make those standards more easily implemented as open source. And here at OASIS, even before we started the Open Projects Initiative, which predates my time here, many of the standards groups that we had would create open repositories on GitHub or way back in the day, SourceForge, that provided sample code or implementations of critical parts of the standards that were being developed. And I think another area where OASIS has tried to raise the bar is really being about open standards. And I'm happy to say that, less than 10% of the 170 plus standards that we've developed over 25 years require royalties to be paid. It's, again, one of the reasons why I wanted, as an open source person, to come to OASIS. And there were some in the open source community that said, that's a strange career move, Guy. You're going to a place that's standards and are all about royalties. But it's great that we have such a small percentage of our standards that have been royalty bearing over the years. I think the synergies between open source and open standards happen in one of three ways. Sometimes the standard comes first. This is the case with UBL, the standard for electronic invoicing that's been pretty widely adopted in Europe, which generated a lot of local profiles, regional public projects, and some open source tools. Sometimes the code comes first. So an example of that is the Star Office software, which built royalty-free Office document spreadsheet presentation. That later became the open document format, which was started here at OASIS and then progressed from us through to an internationally recognized standard with ISO. And sometimes these actually form in parallel. In the case of OASIS, we had the MQTT standard that some of you may be familiar with, the message queuing telemetry transport standard for IoT sensor and device coordination. And that was started both as the standard here at OASIS, and then in conjunction with Eclipse, there was an open source project called PAHO. And those two communities really were able to feed on each other and I think find a lot of commonality. So from here, let's talk about balance. Get my slide to cooperate. There we go. So some of you know Simon Fribs from OSI, and he wrote a couple of really great blog posts recently comparing the coexistence of open source and open standards work to growing blueberries in his garden. And I learned a lot more about blueberries in reading Simon's post, but having a separate place to have just the right conditions for standards is very similar to blueberries because they can be a bit fickle, and you sometimes have to have a kind of a separate part of your garden where you can grow blueberries. Same with standards organizations, a separate part of your organization that is related but has area that really kind of provides the right soil pH and the right conditions. Open source communities are sometimes characterized as really unruly by the folks on the standard side. But I think, again, it's just a different perspective on how the work gets done. And finding balance, to me, is the most important thing here. And I think it's generally easier to do this kind of balance at a neutral body like a consortium or a foundation. A key element of this is the governance process that allows both for a more rigid standards definition to work with some guardrails, as well as a more free-flowing open source project. And I'm not going to belabor the challenges that come with licensing and intellectual property. And some of you will probably ask me questions, which I'll respond with I am not a lawyer. I know a little bit, but I always defer to our lawyers on this. But licensing and intellectual property clearly are a challenge. But I think there's a clear need for both businesses and participants in these projects to find a way to come to a common understanding about what a compatible licensing regime looks like. And I think it's one of the things I've been most happy with in my time here at OASIS is they've really done a lot of thinking around what these things like royalty-free licenses and using OSI licenses on the open project side looks like. So they've done a lot of thinking in that area. So let's talk about something else here, because we touched on it a little earlier, but I think both open source and open standards communities obviously are after the same outcomes. Where things tend to break down is in some of the very different approaches they have to both the culture of the project or the organization and the pace that both communities work at. So there's some things to consider when we attempt to bridge these differences. Sometimes you need to determine how nimble your standards process has to be. Does it have to be a traditional standards development process that some are probably used to, where you map out all possible use cases from the beginning? Or can it be more nimble and iterative, which allows for kind of naturally occurring changes that are driven by outside factors, like an open source project, for example? And then secondly, how much overt and strong governance should an open source project have? And I want to be clear again here, by this, I don't necessarily mean licensing, but are there enough strong companies or personalities that you need to have more explicit rules of the road, contribution guidelines, things like that? Or is it okay to start small and evolve those contribution rules as time goes on? Third, I think it's important to find regular checkpoints where both groups can come together to discuss their latest efforts and find commonalities and differences. So one of the roles I had before I joined OASIS was when I worked with the Samsung Open Source Program Office, and we worked on a standard and open source project with Intel called OIC, or now Open Connectivity Framework, which is a lightweight layer on top of IoT wireless protocols. And that was both a standards effort and an open source, multiple open source efforts, actually. And so one of the things we did was find these regular checkpoints where both groups sort of came together and figured out what they needed to discuss in terms of challenges that were coming up in the standard or in the open source implementation effort. So actually being intentional about finding those regular checkpoints was really, really important. And then fourth, finding common tooling. One of the efforts that I'm working on at OASIS now is in finding and defining what we call repository-based work streams. So those of us who did engineering, have done engineering for a living, are obviously used to repositories, Git, GitHub, et cetera. Not so much on the standard side. So kind of getting the standards folks to understand how you potentially write a standard in that eventually gets down into Markdown, and you can track things with pull requests and things like that is a really, really, I think, valuable exercise. So with that, let's actually talk about the role of foundations and consortiums. And I want to dive a little bit deeper here because I think this is really an area where you can get some serious value by using foundations and consortiums appropriately. And some of these topics are going to be a general nature, applicable to a lot of the different foundations out there. But I'd also like to cover sort of specifically how we approach this at OASIS, because I'm really excited about the way the organization built this even before I joined as their executive director. So let's talk about neutrality. I think when people ask me, it's really the number one reason given by what I think and what I've seen from folks in the open source communities and standards communities. It's the number one reason given by both of those communities when it comes to why do you bring your work to a foundation. I think it's important if you're trying to go for widespread collaboration and really widespread adoption, your work needs to be in a place that doesn't have a vested interest in the outcome of that work. Now, with that said, let's be clear. If you want to build value on top of open source or open standards, it's not only okay, it's really the point. It's incredibly valuable. But providing a space where partners and even more importantly, competitors can come to work together on a foundational piece of technology is key. And neutrality for me typically has two dimensions. The first one is neutrality of governance and process, which is really a common and agreed upon set of kind of rules for the road for collaboration and contribution. Also, neutrality of influence and direction. I think while most work done at foundations is naturally led by the initial project sponsor or sponsors, it's important that there be both a balance and neutrality in the way decisions are handled about things like finances and project direction. So I think foundations give you a framework to sort of manage those challenging issues. And then in addition to neutrality, it's important to talk about fairness, because I think foundations and consortiums are a place that can provide fairness where in the inevitable case of disagreement, and you're going to find this in either within each of these communities or even between the open source and open standard communities. And the main ways that the fairness piece of this occurs are consistent and transparent oversight of the neutral rules and processes, right? So having people who are there to actually provide that consistency and transparency and oversight. And then also consistent and open enforcement of not only the process rules, but also anything else that comes in a community covenant, or more importantly, even things like like codes of conduct. And, I think both of these really require unique skill sets and talents that are generally wielded by a group of individuals in foundations who, we used to call community managers or community shepherds. I think a better term is community stewards. And I'd like to kind of discuss a little bit more about what that entails in terms of community stewardship. So when I was looking to build this presentation, I found this great graphic of what a community manager or community steward looks like. And having done this role myself, this is very apropos with the multiple arms and multiple things that you're doing. Community, though, is often an overloaded or sometimes what we call squishy term. But really strong community stewardship is critical to moving open source and open standards activities forward. And having built communities myself, I can tell you it's very difficult at times. But, I think that it is, to me, like a systems level problem in engineering, which is you have to understand a multitude of variables. And whether that's mitigating disagreements about what goes into a specification, or helping smooth over challenges and what functionality should be in an open source project, the community professionals and foundations are the people who do most of this heavy lifting. And as you can imagine, finding people with these kind of big picture thinking skills, the ability to communicate, the ability to help build these communities can be a challenge, because the role is kind of part program management, part psychology, part traffic cop, part outreach and advocacy. There's a lot of factors that go into this. But my experience is that all successful foundations have one or more of these resources that help identify who the right people are to participate, whether for the open source effort or the standards effort. And increasingly, they're the people that help broker this common intersection between both of these kinds of communities. So with that, let's talk a little bit about specifically how this works for us at OASIS, because I think it was one of the reasons I was most excited to join the organization, because they built the OASIS Open projects about a year before I joined, as really a place to support shared community development of code, of APIs, standards, implementations, open data, under kind of one umbrella with open source licenses and a path to recognition in these international standards bodies that we talked about. And I'm really excited because I feel like we're leading the charge in this area. And we've already got projects that have a strong energy and synergy between the two communities. And I think there's some great areas that can really kind of move the industry forward in this space. So here's kind of what it looks like for us. One of the main things that we offer is a consistent process that kind of takes the traditional standards work as well as the open source work and lets them come through, produce project specifications, which are very similar to the OASIS technical committee specifications, kind of the pure standard side. And after that, they both enter our standardization track if they want. And this can lead to becoming an OASIS recognized standard, something like SAML. But then we can also help them shepherd that standard to get international recognition through ISO, ITU, ANSI, or other organizations like that. But people ask why is getting the international standard important? And I think it not only ensures interoperability is maintained between multiple future implementations, it really helps also with highly regulated procurement pipelines like medical and finance and government. And I did a lot of consulting, 4 or 5 years of consulting with the U.S. Department of Defense, and there was a lot of focus on standards in the procurement process, not as much focus on open source. They're getting better about that now, but I think using standards as a way to get open source more demystified in these highly regulated procurement pipelines is really, really important. One of our first open source projects at OASIS was Baseline, the Baseline protocol, which is a blockchain agnostic way that you can validate private transactions on private ledgers while only leaving public data about those transactions in the Ethereum mainnet. And again, this project is a great example of they built their open source effort, but then they took their API definition and used that as the bones of their specification. And they're in the process of finalizing their first open project spec, which hopefully will lead to a specification that will allow other implementations of that protocol. So what is our approach at OASIS for this? I think really it's about making open standards and open source better together. So, we've been pairing open source and standards outputs, as I mentioned, since 2004. And really, we found that a growing number of collaborators were asking for this hybrid approach. They wanted outcomes, they wanted results. And really, they wanted these specifications, these implementations to be used. So being able to allow for open source and other things that maybe necessarily weren't open source, but allowing multiple implementations and the choice of multiple implementations was important. So on the technical committee side, our pure standard side, I mentioned they can have open source repositories, and our open source projects can create specifications repositories for documenting everything from patterns, data structures, processes, et cetera. So let's take a little bit of a look at the practice of how this works at OASIS. So we attack it kind of from the governance side, the process flow side, and the intellectual property side. And we try to keep this approach multidimensional. And there are a lot of industry studies that have really suggested that you need to keep your approach multidimensional to address all three of these issues. But our design here is meant to encourage really what I call the right amount of process and efficiency curve to the work. So doing things this way kind of lets us be fast when we need to be and lets us be slow when we need to take a little bit more time to make sure that a standard is well baked. And I think it's really important for me that we have an opportunity for subject matter experts and community contributors, anybody who needs to come work on this, they can come work on this. And though when you do that, those who make IP commitments are welcomed, whether their organizations are members of OASIS or not. So we kind of try to practice that, the open piece of, especially on the open project side, that you can come and become a contributor without being a member of OASIS. We do have member organizations that sponsor these efforts and help keep them moving forward. So I did leave plenty of time for questions. We got 10 minutes, looks like. Oh, apologies. There we go. And I think really, we have as much to gain by bringing these things together and very little for keeping these open source and open standards projects separate. So it's also really important, I want to kind of finish with this, that we don't expect every open source project is necessarily going to intersect with a standard, and nor will every open source project want to advance to a spec. But in reaching a certain level of maturity, we're really trying to bring the most benefit from the organization to what a standardization activity can provide. So with that, I am happy to take questions, and it looks like we have a few. Amber, are you gonna, do I have to undo this so I can see questions? Probably.
I think the question that you're seeing on the Q&A was one for Jim. And
oh, okay.
Let's see. So I'm not seeing any new questions right now.
Oh, somebody's gonna ask me a tough question, right?
I hope so. For those that are listening, I hope that you've been pondering some really hard questions, whether philosophical or engineering, that you could ask Guy.
Oh, it was so true. Love this graphic. Okay.
I did have a question for you. And since now I'm on the cyber side of things, like when you were talking, especially with the SolarWinds stuff and everything that's going on, what do you see as the most urgent need for standardization on that side, on the cyber side?
I think it's the SBOM work, the software bill of materials work. So you may be familiar with the gentleman, Alan Friedman at NTIA, which is the Department of Commerce, part of their organization. There's really been a lot of focus and work, and I know President Biden signed an executive order for asking Department of Homeland Security and Department of Commerce to basically go figure out essentially the solution to the SolarWinds and other hacks. And I think it's SBOM, or software bill of materials, is not a silver bullet by any means, but just understanding what software is, what packages are in the software that you bought, whether that's commercial software, whether that's open source software. And remember, most commercial software has, actually, I can't think of much commercial software that doesn't have some open source in it. So really understanding what's comprised in the software you have, I think, is a really, really important piece that we're missing, because it's really difficult to look at. I think combination of SBOM combined with all the threat information that can come through in something like Stix and Taxi is really kind of the impact point, is figuring those two things out. That's kind of table stakes. Without figuring those two things out, it's going to be really, really difficult to mitigate any of these issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You also have a question from Kristen, and I'm going to let her know you're going to answer it live. She says, what are some of the open source projects that are directed toward a standard, new or existing?
Well, there's a lot of them. We have a couple of them here at OASIS. Obviously, I mentioned Baseline. There's work going on in Ethereum, so cryptocurrency, to figure out kind of what standards need to be brought forward there. There's everything going on again in the Open Cybersecurity Alliance that we have, which is those things like the Stix and the Taxis of the world. But it's interesting. I think that kind of finding the new generation of those things that need to be both a standard and an open source project is kind of a little bit of want to say a crystal ball. I'd like to see other people kind of bring that together again in those dimensions that I mentioned, both cybersecurity, especially emergency response. I think when I look at what's happening kind of in emergency response, and obviously you saw the beginning of my presentation, it's a personal passion of mine. I think we're not there yet. I think we're starting to get there, but everything that's happened with COVID, I think, is finally driving people to say, hey, you know what, we need standards for how information is exchanged. We need standards for, you know, how you do vaccination rollouts, and we need open source implementations of those things as well. Public
I
code,
know,
public money.
I know, like on the open compute side, working on the open hardware side of things, there's some projects there, and even Lenaro with Linux on ARM is working with some of the standards organizations in addition to the ones that you've mentioned as well. Kristen, thank you for that question. Great question.
A very great question. Thanks, Kristen.
Guy, is there anything that like you didn't include? Every time I give a presentation, I'm sure you're the same way, or I like to believe that you are. You always think of something that you wished you would have added. Is there anything that maybe with just a few minutes left here, I think 4 minutes, that you would like to tell people about that maybe isn't fully developed and you just want to mention it and get people excited about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, right before the presentation, or actually this morning, I got a bunch of new stuff from my team about, hey, you need to talk more about the OASIS Open Europe Foundation. And I kind of backed off and I added some mentions of it, but people are like, well, I have to say, this isn't supposed to be a sales pitch, right, for these things. And Pod Lewis is very, very intentional about that with all things open. And I want to impart information around the general concepts, but we're really excited about the OASIS Open Europe Foundation because we've been in Europe for a long time. But this is really our opportunity to have a body that's hosted in Europe and that can help drive European specific open source and open standards activities. And there are places and worldwide, we want to get worldwide standards for sure, but there are places and specific factors that are specifically European, that you really need certain standards that are for, European data sovereignty is a great example, right? There's a lot of work going on with the Gaia X initiative around data sovereignty in Europe. And so having the OASIS Open Europe Foundation, which again is a separate entity, so legally separate entity, basically the equivalent of a nonprofit called a stichting in the Netherlands, but that has the tie back to OASIS Global, but really has a focus on helping drive those European specific standards. It's incredibly exciting. Obviously we've been tied in work in the European Commission for a long time through Dr. Carol Cosgrove-Sachs, who leads our efforts there around open standards. So I'm really excited about, and it was just formed at the end of 2020. So we're kind of just bringing that up to speed. And I'm really excited, I think, by what that can do to help drive a lot of these European specific open source and open standards activities.